At 6:15 in the morning on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth crawled into the tail position of B-17 number 42-29896, a bomber the crew had nicknamed Tondelayo after a sultry character from a popular film. He settled onto the bicycle seat that served as his workstation, watching the gray English dawn that would soon carry him 500 miles into Germany. 24 years old, 12 combat missions completed, 3 confirmed kills to his name. What Aruth didn't know, what nobody could have told him, was that German Luftwaffe intelligence officers had positioned over 300 fighters along the route to Kassel. They'd studied the patterns. They knew exactly when the American fighter escorts would turn back. They understood precisely how American tail gunners had been trained to fight. And they'd developed tactics specifically designed to exploit those training doctrines before the gunners could even pull their triggers. The tail gunner position on a B-17 Flying Fortress measured 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. 2 Browning M250 caliber machine guns pointed backward through a curved plexiglass window. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside would drop to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Aruth's electrically heated suit was the only barrier between survival and death by hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war, and they weren't exaggerating. The tail gunner worked completely alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. No one to talk to during the long hours over enemy territory. No one to help if something went catastrophically wrong. Just one man, 2 guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe decided to send his way. The statistics told a story that every tail gunner knew by heart. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. 11 missions out of the 25 required to complete a tour of duty. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Tail gunners died even faster than that average, their position absorbing the first bullets in the German fighters' preferred attack pattern. Only ball turret gunners, cramped into their plexiglass spheres beneath the bomber's belly, faced worse odds. By July of 1943, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations since arriving in England. 90 men gone. 90 families receiving telegrams that began with the words, "We regret to inform you." The problem wasn't courage or skill or dedication. The problem was geometry, pure and simple. German fighter pilots had calculated the angles, measured the distances, and developed an attack pattern that turned American defensive doctrine into a death sentence. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, closing at 350 miles per hour from the 6 o'clock position, had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. 10 seconds might not sound like much, but in aerial combat, it was an eternity. The German pilot could line up his shot, adjust for deflection, and pour 20 mm cannon shells into the bomber's tail section while the American tail gunner was still waiting for the enemy to come within the prescribed engagement range. Those same 10 seconds represented the tail gunner's entire window to hit a target moving at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Most tail gunners never got the chance to use those 10 seconds effectively. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried even heavier armament than the Messerschmitt, two 20 mm cannons and two 13 mm machine guns. A single well-placed burst could shred the plexiglass bubble, protecting the tail gunner, kill him instantly, and disable the tail controls that kept the bomber flying straight and level. Bombers without effective tail protection became easy targets for follow-up attacks. The fighters would circle back, line up their next pass, and finish what they'd started. The bomber would fall away from formation, trailing smoke and fire, while the other aircraft pressed on toward the target. Sometimes parachutes would blossom in the sky below. Sometimes they wouldn't. The standard Army Air Force's gunnery training doctrine taught gunners to wait, to conserve their ammunition, to fire only at ranges under 300 yards. The theory made perfect sense in a classroom where instructors could draw diagrams on blackboards and explain the mathematics of ammunition expenditure. Students could practice on moving targets at controlled distances, calculating deflection angles, and learning to lead their targets properly. The training emphasized accuracy over volume of fire, discipline over aggression. A well-trained gunner, according to the manual, could make 800 rounds of ammunition last an entire mission by firing short, controlled bursts only when the enemy was within effective range. In actual combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting. By the time a tail gunner, following official doctrine, opened fire, German cannon shells might already be tearing through the bomber's aluminum skin. The plexiglass bubble might already be shattering. The gunner might already be dying. Michael Aruth had watched it happen. On his sixth mission, a B-17 flying off Tondelayo's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The tail gunner never fired a single shot. The fighter came in fast, guns blazing, and the first rounds punched through the plexiglass before the American could react according to his training. The bomber fell out of formation immediately, one wing tilting downward, smoke pouring from the shattered tail section. Aruth counted 8 parachutes emerging from the stricken aircraft as it spiraled toward the earth. The tail gunner was not among them. His body remained in the wreckage, never given the chance to defend himself or his crew. The official doctrine demanded patience and fire discipline. Michael Aruth questioned everything about it. The German fighters attacked from maximum range because they knew with absolute certainty that American gunners would hold their fire. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned the patterns through combat experience and intelligence analysis. They'd even captured B-17 and studied the aircraft's defensive capabilities in exhaustive detail. They exploited the American training manual like a detailed road map, knowing exactly how far they could press their attacks before encountering return fire. It was a systematic slaughter based on predictable behavior. But Aruth had been thinking, and what he'd been thinking would eventually change defensive gunnery doctrine for the entire 8th Air Force. 186 B-17 flying fortresses lifted off from bases scattered across eastern England that morning of July 30th. They formed up over the English countryside, squadrons joining into groups, groups combining into combat wings, the entire aerial armada assembling itself with practiced precision. 123 P-47 Thunderbolt fighters would escort them part way into enemy territory. But everyone knew the arithmetic. Fuel limitations meant the fighters would have to turn back over Belgium, leaving the bombers to fly the final 200 miles to Kassel entirely alone. The Germans knew this too. They'd be waiting. Aruth checked his ammunition belts one final time before takeoff. 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. The manual said that was enough for a standard mission, assuming proper fire discipline and adherence to engagement range protocols. Aruth had already decided the manual was wrong about almost everything else. By noon, he would find out if his alternative approach could keep him alive. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral, a folded flag presented to his family, and another name added to the growing list of casualties from the 379th Bombardment Group. The training instructors at gunnery school in Fort Myers, Florida, had drilled their philosophy into every student. Ammunition was a finite resource. Accuracy mattered more than volume of fire. A disciplined gunner who fired controlled bursts at targets within 300 yards could make his ammunition last the entire mission. The doctrine assumed that German pilots would cooperate by attacking within that range and remaining in the kill zone long enough for accurate fire. The Luftwaffe, as Aruth had learned through bitter experience, did not cooperate with American assumptions. German fighter pilots had studied American tactics exhaustively. They knew that gunners waited until 300 yards, so they opened fire at 600 yards, pouring explosive cannon shells into the bomber formations, while the Americans held their triggers and watched death approach. By the time the tail gunners started shooting back, according to doctrine, the damage was often already done. Wings were already burning, engines were already failing, men were already dying. Michael Aruth had calculated the problem from a different angle entirely. A Focke-Wulf 190 at 600 yards wasn't actually a difficult target if you abandoned the conventional thinking. The fighter was flying straight toward you, its nose pointed directly at your position, presenting the largest possible profile to your guns. The closure rate meant the apparent size of the target doubled every few seconds. A gunner who started firing early could walk his tracers onto the approaching fighter, adjusting his aim as the range decreased and the target grew larger in his sight picture. The risk, of course, was ammunition expenditure. 800 rounds sounded like a substantial amount until you divided it by the number of potential attacking fighters. A deep penetration mission might see 15, 20, even 30 separate attacks on a single bomber. At 50 rounds per burst fired at long range, the mathematics turned brutal very quickly. A gunner who fired early and often might run dry before the mission ended, leaving himself defenseless during the critical moments over the target or during the long flight home. Aruth accepted that trade-off. He'd done the calculations in his head during the long hours in the tail position. A gunner who conserved ammunition, according to doctrine, but died on the third or fourth attack, had made a fundamentally poor bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy's attack before it succeeded, even if that meant expending ammunition at rates the training manual would consider wasteful. If running low on bullets became a problem later in the mission, he would deal with that problem when it arrived. Dead men, after all, had no use whatsoever for reserve ammunition carefully conserved in undamaged ammunition cans. His first real test of this alternative approach came on his fourth mission, a raid against German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire in June of 1943. A pair of Messerschmitt 109s approached Tondelayo from the 6 o'clock low position, the classic tail attack that German pilots preferred. Standard doctrine, as Aruth had been taught, said to wait. Let them close to 300 yards. Aim carefully. Fire short bursts. Conserve ammunition for later attacks. Michael Aruth opened fire at 700 yards instead. The tracers arced across the summer sky, falling short at first, disappearing into empty air below the approaching fighters. Aruth adjusted his aim, walking the stream of fire upward toward the lead aircraft. The German pilot saw the tracers coming toward him long before he'd expected to encounter defensive fire. He broke off his attack immediately, diving away before reaching his own effective cannon range. His wingman followed without even attempting to press the attack. Neither fighter scored a hit on Tondelayo. The bomber continued toward Saint-Nazaire untouched. The crew chief questioned Aruth after they landed back at Kimbolton. The ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 200 rounds on a single engagement. At that rate, the crew chief pointed out, Aruth would run out of ammunition before reaching targets deep inside Germany, where the really heavy fighter opposition waited. Aruth explained his reasoning calmly and logically. The crew chief remained skeptical. This wasn't how gunners were supposed to fight. Other tail gunners in the squadron heard about the incident. Some called it reckless, a dangerous violation of established doctrine. Wasting ammunition on long-range shots went against everything the Army Air Forces taught. The training manuals existed for very specific reasons, developed by experts who understood aerial combat far better than some 24-year-old staff sergeant with only a few missions under his belt. Aruth was gambling with his crew's lives, and eventually that gamble would fail catastrophically. But Tondelayo kept coming home. Mission after mission, the bomber returned to Kimbolton with its crew intact, its tail gunner alive and still shooting. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July of 1943, 3 bombers from the squadron had gone down over enemy territory. 30 men lost. Their positions in the formation filled by replacement crews fresh from the United States. Now, on July 30th, crossing into Belgium with the target still hours away, Aruth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings in farewell and turn back toward England. Their fuel gauges demanded retreat. The bombers pressed on alone, deeper into territory controlled by the Third Reich. Somewhere ahead, Luftwaffe controllers were tracking them on radar, vectoring fighters into position for coordinated attacks. Aruth would need every round of ammunition he'd loaded. He would also need to survive long enough to use it effectively. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, still climbing toward bombing altitude. Through his plexiglass window, Aruth watched the water recede behind them, the white cliffs of Dover shrinking to a pale line on the horizon. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, where factories churned out the weapons sustaining Hitler's war machine. The P-47 escorts held their position around the bomber stream, their presence providing temporary safety. But Aruth knew the arithmetic. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. The mission to Kassel would take 6 hours. For most of that journey, the bombers would fly completely alone. The first Messerschmitts appeared at 11:42 in the morning, climbing from the southeast in groups of 4. Aruth counted 8 fighters, then 12, then stopped counting because the numbers didn't matter anymore. The sky behind Tondelayo filled with black crosses painted on yellow noses. The lead fighter began its attack run from the 6 o'clock high position, diving toward the bomber formation at 400 miles per hour. Aruth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each passing second. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life, their hammering vibration transmitted through the bicycle seat directly into Aruth's spine. A stream of tracers arced across the sky, every fifth round burning bright, so the gunner could see where his fire was going. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into empty air below the diving fighter. Aruth adjusted smoothly, walking the fire upward, just as he'd practiced on that mission to Saint-Nazaire. At 600 yards, the tracers began connecting with the target. Bright flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling as 50 caliber bullets punched through aluminum skin. The German pilot broke hard right, smoke trailing from his aircraft. The attack run abandoned before he could fire a single cannon shell. He never completed his firing pass. The fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into the cloud layer 8,000 feet below. Whether the pilot survived to be captured or died in the crash, Aruth would never know. He had no time to watch. The second attacker was already closing from a different angle, coming in lower, trying to slip beneath Aruth's field of fire. The angle was difficult, requiring him to depress his guns nearly to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, sending a long burst toward the approaching Focke-Wulf. The German pilot flinched, pulling up early and releasing his cannon shells into empty sky above Tondelayo. Another attack disrupted. Another German fighter pilot forced to break off before inflicting damage. The attacks continued for 47 minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the bomber formation, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft with predatory precision. Aruth fired at everything that came within range, burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red from sustained fire, the heat visible even in bright daylight. The plexiglass around him filled with the acrid smell of burned gunpowder and hot metal. At 12:29, a Messerschmitt 109 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level with either extraordinary courage or catastrophically poor judgment. Aruth centered the fighter perfectly in his gun sight and held both triggers down. The Brownings hammered for 6 continuous seconds, pouring over 100 rounds into the approaching aircraft at point-blank range. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in mid-air. The engine separated from the fuselage. The wings folded backward like paper. What remained of the fighter tumbled past Tondelayo, close enough for Aruth to see the empty cockpit through the wreckage. The pilot had either ejected at the last moment or died at his controls. 2 confirmed kills so far, ammunition down to 180 rounds remaining, and the formation hadn't even reached the target yet. The bomber stream arrived over Kassel at 12:51 and began its bombing run. For 11 minutes, the aircraft flew absolutely straight and level, unable to maneuver while the bombardiers lined up their targets in their Norden bomb sites. The Luftwaffe knew this moment represented the bombers' maximum vulnerability. They couldn't dodge. They couldn't weave. They had to hold formation and heading while bombs fell toward the factories below. The German fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury, knowing the Americans couldn't take evasive action. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from the 5 o'clock position. Aruth swung his guns to meet it, firing a short burst. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root, but the pilot kept coming, his own cannons blazing. 20-millimeter shells tore through Tondelayo's tail section. Aruth felt the impacts before he felt the pain. Fragments ripped through the plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and burying themselves in his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed immediately, the feed mechanism shattered by the same cannon shell that had wounded him. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment, coating everything in slippery red liquid. Aruth kept firing with his right gun, one-handed, bleeding. He tracked the damaged Focke-Wulf as it pulled away from its attack run. A final burst caught the fighter's tail assembly. The aircraft snap-rolled violently and dove toward the ground. His 3rd kill of the mission. The intercom crackled with voices from the forward part of the aircraft. Someone was asking about damage reports. Someone else reported flak bursts ahead. Aruth tried to respond, but his throat had gone completely dry. Blood pooled on the floor of his compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air at altitude. 400 rounds expended since the first attack. 63 rounds remaining. 3 German fighters destroyed, and the mission was only half over. Tondelayo still had to fly 250 miles back to England through the same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed him on the way in. Aruth wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm, pulled it tight with his teeth, and waited for the next attack. He would fight with one gun and 63 rounds, if that's what survival required. The return flight began at 13:04. Tondelayo turned westward with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a column of black smoke that rose thousands of feet into the summer sky. Aruth remained at his position despite his wounds, scanning through blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe was not finished. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, positioning themselves along the bomber stream's route back to the English Channel. Fresh aircraft replaced those lost or damaged in the morning's attacks. The second gauntlet would be every bit as dangerous as the first. Aruth's left arm had gone completely numb from a combination of cold and shock. His jammed gun remained inoperable, the mechanism too damaged for field repair. He had one functioning weapon and 63 rounds of ammunition to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace. The mathematics demanded a completely different approach now. At 63 rounds, he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of 20 rounds each, assuming he fired with perfect discipline. Every trigger pull had to count. The luxury of suppressive fire at long range was gone. At 13:31, a pair of Messerschmitt 109s closed from the 7 o'clock position. Aruth waited until 500 yards this time, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine, cowling dead center. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing white glycol coolant from a punctured cooling system. The wingman broke off without attacking, unwilling to press forward alone. 51 rounds remaining. Tondelayo crossed back into France at 14:15. The fighter attacks diminished gradually as the Luftwaffe reached the limit of their operational range. By 14:47, the bomber formation had outrun the last German interceptors. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later, that narrow strip of water representing safety and survival. The landing at Kimbolton came at 15:52. Aruth could not climb out of his compartment without assistance. The ground crew pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him directly to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds in Aruth's arm, shoulder, and upper back. None had struck major blood vessels or nerves. He would recover fully. But the word was already spreading through the 379th Bombardment Group even before the surgeon finished his examination. The tail gunner on Tondelayo had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with only 63 rounds of ammunition remaining. The mission intelligence report specifically noted his early engagement technique as a contributing factor to the bomber's survival. Other tail gunners began asking questions. The standard doctrine said, wait until 300 yards. Aruth had opened fire at 800. The doctrine said, conserve ammunition carefully. Aruth had burned through 700 rounds before getting hit. The doctrine, applied by the book, produced dead gunners. Aruth was still alive. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer reviewed the combat footage from Tondelayo's gun cameras. The film showed Aruth's tracers reaching out far beyond normal engagement range, disrupting attack runs before German pilots could establish stable firing solutions. The early fire forced the enemy to maneuver defensively, degrading their accuracy and reducing the number of hits on the bomber. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron had adopted variations of Aruth's technique. Their survival rates improved measurably. The bombers they protected returned to base with noticeably less battle damage. The correlation was becoming difficult to ignore. The 379th Group commander received a preliminary report on September 1st. The data suggested that aggressive early fire at extended ranges reduced bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated fighter attacks before they could develop. The implications challenged 2 years of established gunnery doctrine developed by Training Command back in the United States. But the numbers didn't lie. Tail gunners who engaged early and aggressively survived longer than those who followed the manual precisely. Meanwhile, Michael Aruth recovered from his wounds at the base hospital. The fragment damage had missed all the critical structures. The flight surgeon cleared him for return to duty on August 19th, 3 weeks after the Kassel mission. Tondelayo had been waiting for him, though technically it was a different aircraft. The old bomber had been written off after accumulating too much battle damage for economical repair. The replacement carried the same name, the same squadron markings, and most importantly, the same crew. Aruth climbed back into the tail position on August 26th. But the Luftwaffe had noticed something changing in the American bomber formations. Their intelligence officers were studying the problem carefully. By early September of 1943, German intelligence officers had documented a clear pattern. American tail gunners were opening fire earlier, sometimes at ranges exceeding 600 yards. The change was disrupting attack formations that had worked reliably for months. German fighter pilots reported the shift in their debriefings across occupied Europe. The approach from 6 o'clock, once considered the safest angle against B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous. Tracers reached out before pilots could establish stable firing platforms. The psychological effect proved significant. A pilot watching tracers stream toward his aircraft at long range instinctively maneuvered even when the rounds were falling short of their target. That instinctive reaction disrupted aim, degraded accuracy, and shortened the time available for effective fire. The Luftwaffe's tactical response came in 3 distinct phases. First, they increased approach speeds, diving on bomber formations at maximum velocity to reduce exposure time to defensive fire. Second, they shifted attack angles, approaching from the high 6 o'clock position where gravity would assist their pullout after the firing pass. Third, they began specifically targeting aircraft that appeared to have aggressive tail gunners, hoping to eliminate the most dangerous threats before the new technique could spread throughout the American bomber forces. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem. Faster approaches meant less accurate shooting. Steeper angles increased the difficulty of tracking targets through the dive. Targeting aggressive gunners required identifying them in advance, which was nearly impossible in the chaos of a running air battle with dozens of bombers and fighters mixing together at high altitude. The 379th Bombardment Group flew 11 missions between August 26th and September 5th. Aruth participated in 4 of them, adding 2 more confirmed kills to his growing record. Other tail gunners in the group claimed an additional 7 German fighters destroyed. The Luftwaffe's loss ratio against the Triangle K bombers of the 379th was climbing steadily. German fighter commanders tried concentrating their attacks, massing against single groups instead of spreading interceptors across the entire bomber stream, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers. The tactic produced catastrophic results on September 3rd, when concentrated attacks against the 100th Bombardment Group destroyed 8 aircraft in 15 minutes. The 379th escaped that particular slaughter by flying in a different position within the combat box formation. But the lesson was unmistakably clear. The Luftwaffe was adapting, searching for weaknesses in the new defensive approach, testing different tactics to counter the aggressive gunnery that was costing them fighters and pilots. The air war over Europe had become a deadly contest of tactical innovation, with each side studying the other's methods and developing countermeasures. Aruth understood the stakes perfectly. His technique worked because it surprised the enemy. Once the Germans developed truly effective responses, the temporary advantage would disappear. Every mission was a test. Every engagement generated data that both sides would analyze. The edge that aggressive fire provided was eroding gradually with each passing week. The mission, scheduled for September 6th, would target Stuttgart, deep in southern Germany. The route would carry the bombers over 500 miles of enemy territory, the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition from bases in France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Stuttgart manufactured ball bearings, components absolutely essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon system in the German arsenal. The strategic importance made it one of the most heavily defended targets in all of Europe. Flak batteries ringed the city in multiple defensive belts. Fighter squadrons were positioned along every likely approach route. The briefing on September 5th laid out the challenge in stark terms. The 379th would fly in the lead position of the combat wing, responsible for navigation and bomb aiming for all the formations following behind. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level while other groups maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Aruth checked his guns that evening with obsessive care. Both Brownings were freshly serviced, the feed mechanisms smooth and reliable, the barrels replaced after accumulating too many rounds through the previous missions. He loaded 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 800. The extra ammunition added weight to the tail section, but weight seemed far less important than firepower. Tomorrow would test everything he had learned through 12 previous missions and 2 separate woundings. Tomorrow would determine whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of his entire combat career. The Stuttgart mission launched at 5:40 on the morning of September 6th. 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky, forming up over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tondelayo flew in the lead element of the 379th Formation, positioned exactly where Aruth would face the first attacks from any direction. The fighters found them over France at 9:15. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields scattered across the region, climbing to intercept the bomber stream before it reached German airspace. The initial attacks came from the 11 o'clock position, head-on passes that tested the nose gunners rather than the tail defenses. Aruth waited and watched, tracking contrails multiply behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was building strength, assembling fighters from multiple units into one concentrated force. By 9:40, intelligence estimates counted over 100 interceptors shadowing the bombers. The rear attacks began at 10:08. A staffel of 12 Messerschmitt 109s positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled up sharply in a coordinated climbing attack from 6 o'clock low. Aruth opened fire at 700 yards, sending tracers into the lead element. 2 fighters broke off immediately, unwilling to fly through the defensive fire. A third absorbed multiple hits and fell away smoking, its pilot struggling to maintain control. The remaining 9 pressed their attack with grim determination. Cannon shells ripped through the formation, striking bombers throughout the 379th Combat Box. The B-17 flying off Tondelayo's left wing took hits to its number 3 engine. Another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel from ruptured tanks in its wings. Aruth kept firing, shifting from target to target as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition counter dropped steadily, 600 rounds, 500, 400. The attacks showed absolutely no sign of diminishing. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondelayo from directly above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach until the last possible moment. Aruth spotted the fighter too late to bring his guns fully to bear. 20-millimeter shells punched through the tail section before he could fire a single round. The impacts threw him hard against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed instantly, the receiver shattered by a direct hit. Fragments tore through his flight suit, opening fresh wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood poured down his face, partially blinding him. He kept firing with the right gun, tracking the Focke-Wulf as it pulled up and rolled away. His tracers caught the fighter's fuselage stitching a line of hits from tail to cockpit. Smoke began trailing from the German aircraft as it disappeared from view. Aruth wiped blood from his eyes with his sleeve and searched for the next attacker, fighting through pain and shock. Tondelayo was dying beneath him. The fighter's cannon fire had severed critical hydraulic lines, damaged the tail control surfaces, and punctured fuel tanks in the wing roots. The pilots fought to maintain altitude, but the bomber was losing its battle against gravity and aerodynamics. The damage was simply too extensive. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04. Tondelayo held position just long enough to release its bombs over the target, then fell out of formation as the accumulated damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. 2 engines were running rough, their RPMs fluctuating wildly. The fuel situation had become critical. The pilots made their decision over eastern France. Tondelayo could not reach England. The best option available was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air-sea rescue units might reach them before hypothermia killed everyone in the water. Aruth remained at his position as the bomber descended, watching for fighters that might pursue the crippled aircraft to finish it off. None came. The Luftwaffe had other targets, healthier bombers still flying in tight formation. Tondelayo hit the channel at 15:12, impacting the gray water at 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact, the aluminum skin splitting along stress points. Aruth was thrown forward violently, his head striking the gun mount hard enough to knock him unconscious. When he regained consciousness, he was floating in a life raft, salt water soaking his flight suit. British rescue boats were approaching across the waves. All 10 crew members had survived the ditching, though several were injured. The bomber that had carried them through 17 missions together now lay at the bottom of the English Channel, settling into the mud and silt. The 379th Commander was already requesting copies of Aruth's mission reports before the rescue boats even reached shore. The Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived on October 14, 1943. The second highest military decoration the United States Army could award, recognized Aruth's actions during both the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation specifically mentioned his decision to continue firing while wounded, crediting his defensive fire with protecting the bomber during its most vulnerable moments. The medal was nice. The recognition was appreciated. But what mattered more to Aruth was the news that arrived with the citation. The 8th Air Force gunnery staff had completed their comprehensive analysis by late October. The data covered 14 bomber groups across 3 months of sustained operations. The conclusions challenged fundamental assumptions that had governed American air combat doctrine since 1942. Tail gunners who engaged targets beyond 500 yards showed measurably higher survival rates than those who followed standard doctrine religiously. The early fire disrupted enemy attack formations, forcing German pilots to maneuver defensively rather than establishing stable firing platforms for their own weapons. The ammunition cost was undeniably significant. Aggressive gunners burned through their loads far faster than conservative shooters. But the statistical trade-off clearly favored the aggressive approach. Dead gunners had no opportunity to conserve ammunition for later in the mission. Living gunners who ran low on ammunition at least had the chance to survive until fighter escorts arrived or the formation escaped the combat zone. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command's Operational Planning Staff, reviewed the findings personally. The implications extended far beyond individual aircraft. If coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt massed fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine might require fundamental revision. The formal policy change came in November of 1943. New gunnery guidelines explicitly authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The bureaucratic language was cautious and hedged with qualifications, but the underlying meaning was crystal clear. The approach that had kept Michael Aruth alive through 17 missions was becoming official doctrine for the entire 8th Air Force. Aruth never saw the policy take full effect across the bomber forces. His head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than initial medical assessments had indicated. After returning to limited flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers grounded him permanently. Recurring headaches and vision problems made continued combat duty impossible and dangerous. His final combat record stood at 17 confirmed kills, with 4 additional probables, still awaiting verification through gun camera footage and witness statements. The number placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the entire 8th Air Force. Some records credited him with as many as 19 victories, though documentation inconsistencies made precise counts difficult to establish with certainty. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross onto his uniform. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative combat achievements across 20 missions. The Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds. By the time his combat career ended involuntarily, Michael Aruth had accumulated more decorations than most bomber pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months after Aruth's grounding, flying through the brutal winter of 43, the invasion summer of 44, and the final campaigns that brought Nazi Germany to its knees in 45. The tactics Aruth had pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command like ripples across water. Tail gunners across dozens of groups adopted variations of the early engagement doctrine. The statistical impact emerged gradually, but unmistakably. Bomber loss rates declined measurably through 1944, though multiple factors contributed to the improvement. Longer-range fighter escorts reduced the bomber's exposure to unprotected combat. Improved aircraft systems enhanced overall survivability. German fighter strength gradually diminished under the sustained aerial offensive. But defensive gunnery also played a significant role in the improving statistics, and the shift toward aggressive fire was an important component of that improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change and reported it in their debriefings. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew mentioned the increased danger of tail attacks against American formations. The easy kills that had characterized early bomber interceptions became progressively harder to achieve as 1943 turned into 44. Some experienced pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks, accepting the higher closure rates and reduced firing time in exchange for avoiding the concentrated rear hemisphere fire that Aruth's techniques had helped develop. Michael Aruth shipped home to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned him to training duties, putting his hard-won combat experience to work preparing new gunners for deployment overseas. He spent the remainder of the war teaching others the techniques that had kept him alive through 20 missions over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The students who passed through his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany, over Japan, over every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. The impact rippled outward, affecting thousands of men who would never know his name. What Michael Aruth did after the war surprised everyone who knew him. He did not leave military service when the fighting ended. He transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 and continued serving for another 15 years. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe, who had been wounded twice and ditched in the English Channel, who had every reason to return to civilian life, chose instead to remain in uniform until 1962, retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant. The decision puzzled some who knew his history. Aruth had accumulated enough combat experience and trauma for several lifetimes. He had faced death more times than official records could properly capture. Most veterans with similar experiences wanted nothing more than to put the war behind them and build peaceful civilian lives. But Aruth saw things differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he had developed, often through trial and error and at great personal risk, had saved lives. Not just his own life, but the crews who flew with him and the gunners who learned from his methods and survival. Walking away from that felt like abandoning something fundamentally important. His post-war years were deliberately quiet. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences, except with other veterans who understood. The medals stayed in a drawer, brought out only for the occasional reunion or memorial service. The memories stayed carefully compartmentalized, locked away in places where they couldn't intrude on daily life. Like many veterans of his generation, Aruth believed that those who had not been there, who had not felt the hammering vibration of twin 50s firing at maximum rate, who had not watched friends die in burning aircraft, could never truly understand what he had experienced. Elmer Bendenier, Tondelayo's navigator, took a different path after the war. He became a successful journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses. The book described the crew's experiences in vivid detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to the passage of time. Bendener's account ensured that Tondelayo and her crew would not be forgotten, that their story would endure beyond the memories of those who lived it. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades after the war ended. Veterans gathered annually to remember friends who had not returned, to share stories their families had never heard, to honor the young men they had once been. Aruth attended when his health permitted, reconnecting with survivors from those desperate months over occupied Europe. The bonds formed in combat endured long after the guns fell silent. The National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received Michael Aruth's remains on February 20th, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. The headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. It did not mention the 17 fighters he had destroyed or the crews he had protected through aggressive defensive fire, or the doctrine he had helped reshape through practical application under combat conditions. Military cemeteries are full of such understatements. The stones mark names and dates, but cannot possibly capture the full weight of what those names represent. Aruth lies among thousands of other veterans, each with stories that deserve preservation and remembrance. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, maintains extensive archives from the bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bombardment Group's records are preserved there, including mission reports that document Aruth's combat achievements in dry, official language. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through documents that bear his direct influence. Watching official policy shift to accommodate lessons learned at terrible cost. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft that carried men like Michael Aruth into combat have mostly vanished, reduced to museum pieces and carefully maintained memorial displays. Modern warfare happens at speeds and ranges that would seem incomprehensible to the men who fought in plexiglass bubbles over Germany. But the fundamental principles Aruth demonstrated, the value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to challenge doctrine that was demonstrably getting men killed, those principles endure across generations and technologies. Michael Aruth never sought recognition or fame. He did what seemed necessary to survive and protect his crew. When official doctrine proved inadequate in actual combat, he adapted and innovated. When his methods showed promise, he shared them freely with other gunners facing the same deadly challenges. When the war ended, he continued serving quietly, passing his knowledge to the next generation. His story wasn't preserved because he was the loudest voice or the most decorated hero. It survived because the principles he applied and the courage he demonstrated represented something worth remembering. The tail gunners of World War II faced impossible odds in cramped, freezing positions, defending against fighters that could kill them before they could respond. Most followed their training faithfully and died accordingly. A few, like Michael Aruth, questioned the doctrine, tested alternatives, and survived to change how everyone else fought. The 17 German fighters he destroyed represented individual tactical victories. The hundreds or thousands of lives saved by the doctrine, changes his combat experience helped inspire, represent his true legacy. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the men who fought and died in the skies over Europe, hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm to show this story to more people who might otherwise never hear it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because we bring you these forgotten stories of courage and innovation every single day. Real people, real heroism, real history that deserves to be remembered and honored. Drop a comment right now telling us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, somewhere else entirely? Our community of history enthusiasts stretches across the entire world. You're not just a passive viewer clicking through content. You're actively participating in keeping these memories alive, ensuring that men like Michael Aruth don't disappear into the silence of forgotten history. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in World War II. Tell us what this story meant to you. Just let us know you're here, that you heard this story, that you'll remember the tail gunner who changed how America defended its bombers and saved countless lives through aggressive fire at ranges the training manual said were too far to be effective. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories. Thank you for making sure Michael Aruth's courage and innovation are not forgotten. These men deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen, one view and one share at a time.